I think for many of us, the question that we ask around church is, can we survive? And it's a question our parishioners ask as well. When we come to ask what Jesus says about survival, how can I put it nicely? He's not terribly sympathetic to that concern, right? He says, he calls the crowd and says to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life, that's us, right? We want to save our life. Oh, we'll lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. And isn't that an interesting pairing? He doesn't just say for my sake, he says for my sake and for the gospel, because they are so integrally connected that where Jesus is, there is good news. And there is no good news, ultimately, that doesn't have Jesus at the heart of it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? I was very struck by what Ted was saying this morning, how there was a church that had set aside some of the things that they would have done otherwise and done stuff that was new, that was sacrificial. They deliberately took up a cross which was an expression of their following of Jesus. And it was tough. But why did he feel like crying? Why did he get choked up? Because it brought him joy. Why are we surprised that as that church were living out the gospel, laying down their lives, it brought new life and it brought them joy? Here is a really interesting statement from William Temple, Archbishop of Canterbury in the mid-1930s. It's amazing that people were saying this back then. It is clear that the church only fulfills its function as the body of Christ if it is constantly thinking how those outside are to be won inside. We could stop right there, couldn't we? Constantly thinking. The preoccupation of the church should be with those outside. Not an occupation, not even the occupation, the preoccupation, that which occupies us before anything else occupies us. But, surprise, very few church people have any conscious sense of responsibility with regard to people who are detached from the church. As we look around, we recognize that we are eagerly absorbed, perhaps inevitably, in maintaining the life for the congregation that is already secure, and not thinking very much about those who are completely detached. We're too much concerned about other things. And you know what the other things as well as I do. A priest friend of mine was very struck recently rereading the parable of the lost sheep. She thought, but most of my pastoral life, the life of a shepherd, is actually concerned with taking care of the 99. Well, she should be so lucky as to have 99 in her congregation. She said, but Jesus, the Good Shepherd, actually isn't too concerned about the 99. He's not there, he's off looking for the one. It's a very bad use of resources. It's so labor-intensive to go and look for that one. But that's what we do, isn't it? We look after the 99. William Temple, I think, is saying, well, in your leadership meetings, whether they be monthly, whether they're called parish councils or whatever you call them, where does concern for outsiders come on the agenda? Does it ever come? And if it comes, where does it come? If it's our preoccupation, I think he's saying maybe it should be the first item ahead of some other items on the agenda. Although the question we ask is how can we get other people to help us survive? How can we get bums in pews? How can we get new people to take envelopes? According to Jesus, that's actually the wrong question to be asking. The better question is how can we help other people experience the gospel? The one is a recipe for death. It's not my being melodramatic, I'm just paraphrasing what Jesus said. The other is actually a recipe for life. Whether it gets more people through the door, frankly, is not our concern. Our job is to share the gospel. And that's because that is, when I say it's a recipe for life, it's a recipe for life for others, but actually also a recipe for life for us. A more recent Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, Dave Robinson has already quoted him, has introduced Anglicans to, I think, a very helpful phrase. He's talked about the mixed economy of church, a both and. This comes out of the British situation where there's a lot of new stuff going on, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But there's then been tension between existing churches, often called inherited churches, which is much more polite than saying traditional churches, and these new things, each saying, why are these new things getting all the attention and all the money and all the resources? We're the existing church. We know those things. And of course, the young Turks out there doing new stuff out in the secular world saying, how come these inherited churches have all these resources and staff and money? What about us? So on the one hand, he says rightly, we want to help inherited churches become mission-shaped, which simply means instead of only thinking about themselves and their survival, they think about those, as William Temple said, those on the outside, those with no church connection. How do we help them do that turnaround? But then on the other hand, he says we want to help establish what in the British scene has been called fresh expressions of church. Someone this morning turned to use the word emergent churches. In a sense, they are kissing cousins, fresh expressions and emergent churches. The big difference is that in Britain, the fresh expressions of church are by and large operating under the umbrella and with the permission of the historic denominations, which is a somewhat different scene from what's happening in the States. Take your pick, but they are responding to the same impulse. So let me picture those two options that Rowan Williams describes this way. Here is the come model, come to us. And we know that people come for rites of passage, they come to sing in the choir, they come because there are social groups that use the existing facility. And that's good, there is a place for that. But then there is also the go function that those of us who are in traditional churches tend to have neglected. The first is easier. But that may make itself felt in terms of people meeting in homes or in apartment blocks. Someone with time on their hands figured out that people who live in apartments and high-rises are 7 times less likely to go to church than people who live in houses. Think about it. Some of those things may happen in places where people gather, whether it is pubs or coffee shops or wherever. So what I want to do in this session is to look at these in turn and say, if we are an inherited church on the one hand, what are some things that we can do to turn outwards and become more missional with the gospel? And the other half will then be, how can we do the go part of this? What might this look for us in our community? So I have about 10 suggestions for what we can do if we're in inherited churches, and don't worry, none of them is very long. Number one, I think you will especially like, and that is, don't beat yourself up. A church is declining, I must be doing something wrong, I should be praying more, or preaching harder, or raising more money. Well, maybe you should. But what is going on is a huge societal shift. You know, in the financial crisis of a couple of years back, it was no use you and I saying we should have made different investments, otherwise, you know, the economy would not be in trouble. It's much bigger than us. And many of the things that are happening are outside our control. Doesn't mean there is nothing we can do, but it is not all your personal responsibility. I think that needs to be said. Here's number 2. We need to be asking God what we can do. There is a certain instinct in churches, I think, when we realize things are going wrong, that we panic and think, we've got to do something. And we do the first thing that comes to hand. And it may not be the right thing. So I've come across recently this cool phrase called missional discernment. Doesn't that sound cool? It basically means listening and looking for God. Where is God at work? Again, I'll say more about that as time goes on. But mission is God's work, just as the gospel is God's work. It begins with God. So we start by saying, God, where are you at work? What are you asking us to do? So not to start with panic, but to start with quiet, in the presence of God, seeking the Spirit of God. Here's the third one, and this is maybe a little harder. I really think we need a budget line for outreach. No, it may not say outreach, it may say youth mission trip, or it may say food bank, or it may say advertising in the community. But you look at your budget, what budget items are to do with folk who don't yet come to church? People don't like that, you know. Because we like the feeling when we look at the budget, I put money into the budget, I give my envelopes, I like the fact that I'm giving to the organist's salary and I get something back for it. It's very simple. I pay for the service, I get the service. Who are these people who have a budget line in our budget? I don't know them. I've never seen them. Are they ever going to go to church? Are they ever going to take envelopes? When is the payback for this investment in them? So there's resistance. But we need to push and say, no, this is important. This is what the church is for. A budget line. And of course, all of the things that I'm going to say are to do with that thing that Jesus says about giving up your life. If you want to save your life, you've got to give your life away. And part of our life, frankly, is our money and our budget. Here's number 4. This is a very obvious one. Be welcoming. Who was it told us that story this morning about nobody can speak to a newcomer until the pastor has spoken to them? Many churches struggle with this issue. They will say, oh, we're a friendly congregation, and what that means is they're friendly to one another. Well, of course they are. They've known each other 100 years. If they couldn't stand each other, they'd have gone somewhere else. But someone coming in, I heard of a church, a young woman checking out church went for the first time, and at the end of the service, the 10 members stood around her and gazed at this alien being, a visitor, had no idea what to say. And eventually said, would you like envelopes? On her first visit. Michael Pearce was the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada for some years, and his wife Dorothy describes being in, I think, their first church in Winnipeg, and she, being, a good clergy spouse, went to help in the kitchen. They were cutting up the pies for a community supper. And after a few minutes, one said to Dorothy, excuse me, around here we cut the pies into 8 slices, not 6. How do you think she felt? You probably have your own horror stories, and I could add to them. Anglicans in the Diocese of Toronto, I think, are tired of seeing this little booklet I wrote. Right, I think the laughter means yes. The subtitle is, what is the subtitle? 8
ways your church can help.
8 ways your church can help. I despise titles like that, but you know what? It actually helps. I do happen to have some copies, if they would be helpful to you, where I go into detail. What does it take for a person to come to your church for the first time just to check you out, to get to the point of saying, I think I want to be a follower of Jesus, how soon can I be baptized? What are the steps that need to be in place in order for that to take place? Because generally we think if a visitor comes back 2 weeks in a row, we've got them for life. Maybe you have, but the question is, are they growing into disciples, into apprentices of Jesus Christ? So I'm not going to spend more time on that, but I just want to signal it as something that any of us can do. It is a very, very early preliminary thing. Be friendly to new people. Now, this is very obvious, and some of you will roll your eyes. You'll do it inside, not outside, because you're too well behaved to actually let me see you roll your eyes. I know that. But how can your church serve the surrounding community? This is an example I picked up from a little village of Chinnor outside Oxford a couple of years ago. They've done something I've never come across any other church doing. They have a lot of active retired people in their congregation. So they have found among themselves what gifts they have, what time they have available to serve the community outside the church, and have made it known in the community. For instance, if you are a senior who can't drive, someone from the church will drive you to your hospital appointment. They heard of someone who was sick in hospital. They got people together to go and decorate that person's apartment while they were in hospital. Worries me a little bit whether the person would like the way they decorated when they came back. But they have an email list, so a request comes in. The person who coordinates it simply sends out the message to the dozen people on the list and says, so-and-so needs a ride to the hospital, Tuesday, 4 o'clock, is there anyone who can take her? And the first person who replies yes gets to be the one who does it. It's really not that complicated. Again, with this and all of the examples that I offer you, I'm not saying this is what anybody should do. I'm just saying, here's an example. Maybe it will prompt something in your congregation that will be better and indeed more appropriate for your community and your culture. Here's another, I think, desperately simple one. Teach the faith. You say, I do that every Sunday. Yes, you do, but the life of every parish, I think, is it's like a conveyor belt, right? It's always in motion. And someone who is new, who's maybe exploring their spirituality, they've got to somehow jump onto that moving conveyor belt. So I think it is good for every church to have a place where the conveyor belt stops, such that you can say on a Sunday morning, if you happen to be new, what are the chances? Okay, it may happen, it may be Christmas, it may be Easter. If you've never figured out what you believe and you think maybe church can help you, you might like to come to this 4-week series that we just happen to be starting next Wednesday. Now, if you're in a city, in a university environment, as we are in Hamilton, it's a bit of a joke to call it Christianity 101 because it resonates with people in the university world. If you're not around people who are university graduates, just call it Christian Basics or whatever you want to call it. Choose a name that is suitable. And just teach the basics. Stop the conveyor belt. This is an idea of Harold Percy's that I picked up and adapted. And Harold will always add a little rider just to say, even if you're not new, if you've been coming to this church for 100 years and you feel you would like a refresher course, this might be for you. So that preserves the person's dignity. A person who's been coming 100 years doesn't want to go to a course for beginners. But if they say, oh yeah, I could use a refresher, that makes it okay. And there's the chance just to go back to basics. This is my own read on basics. We do a session called Why Should I Even Bother with Christianity? Which is laying out what is the gospel. The second week we talk about what's so special about Jesus and talk about incarnation, atonement, resurrection, and so on. The third week we talk about the school of Jesus. What does it mean to be a Christian? And I like to use the image of the apprentice. To most people the word disciple doesn't convey a whole lot. Often you hear it paraphrased, well, a disciple is a student. But on our world, often students are those who sit in rows and listen to lectures and take notes, as some of you are doing right now. It's not generally what Jesus had in mind. Much more, he had in mind, be an apprentice. Learn from me day by day as you walk with me and work with me what it means to live in the ways of the kingdom. So that's the third one about what it means to be a Christian. It means to be an apprentice of Jesus. And the fourth one, something about, I like Jesus, but I hate church, which is a quote from my daughter when she was about 5. She knew the Jesus bit would please me, but then she needed to get the bit in about church. So what is the point of church? Well, you can make up your own curriculum. It really doesn't matter. But I'm just saying, provide a place. Not only will it be helpful for new people to grasp the basics of the faith, but frankly, those who've been in church for 100 years, like the gentleman I mentioned yesterday who said, I don't think I've ever heard the gospel, it's an opportunity for them to go back over the basics and hear the gospel maybe for the first time. And I say to students, and I'm sure Wycliffe graduates here remember this vividly, you should do this at least once a year, even if only 3 or 4 people come. Here's number 7. Would you consider preaching a sermon series? We do this at least once a year with an eye to people outside the church. There was a church actually near us in Hamilton that had its sign up a couple of Sundays ago advertising the Sunday sermon, and the title of the sermon was, Consider This. I thought, consider this? What the heck is that about? My wife gets tired of me saying of certain things like that. That'll pull the crowds in, won't it? Well, this is one that we did at our church a couple of years ago, a series on personal identity. People who generally people under 30 who are saying, who am I? What is my place in the world? And if you can see the small print at the bottom featuring Lady Gaga, Johnny Depp, Matt Damon, Weird Al, Billy Elliot, Cinderella, and a host of others. So I got to talk on the Lady Gaga song, Born This Way, and say, actually, it's more a matter of how God shapes you in your life. You could do this. It's not that difficult. One of the most effective we ever did was one Advent. We did 4 Sundays when the sermons were on Christmas movies. We had 4 people who could preach. Everyone did one. I got the Grinch. I'm not quite sure what that... Thanks, Dave. Someone else did It's a Wonderful Life. Someone did Christmas Carol. I forget what the 4th one was. But we put a a very simple A-frame sign outside the church saying 4 sermons during, I don't know if we even use the word Advent, during December on Christmas movies. One woman walked in off the street simply because she saw the sign. This was December. The following April, she was baptized. She is still an active member of the church. In fact, she looks after the jam and jelly stall for the bazaar. Now, how much more committed can you be than that? So think about it. Someone mentioned this morning Acts 17, Paul at Athens, where he engages with things in the culture of the Athenians. And he starts off by saying, as I walked around the city, I looked carefully at the objects of your worship. So this kind of sermon series often begins by looking carefully again, what movies are people watching? What kind of music are they listening to? We need to engage with those things. Why not do a sermon series? Not only will visitors thank you, people in the congregation will say, wow, I never realized that church has anything to do with those things in the culture. These are getting a little more challenging as time goes on. Be generous with your space. And I have 2 stories along this line. One is from a Free Methodist church plant in Sarnia. The Free Methodists are probably the most active church planting denomination. Any Free Methodists here? But a friend of mine started this church in Sarnia called The Story. Why do churches always have to be Saint somebody? Saint David, Saint Knox? Or, no, you know who I mean. Called it The Story, and I don't need to tell you why. So the Christian community got involved with the arts community in Sarnia. Once a year they do an arts festival, I think is about 10 days long. And they were looking for different locations around the city in order to do art displays. And they needed one more. And Joe, who is the pastor of The Story, said, well, you could use our worship space. That's the door of their worship space. And they said, no, that wouldn't work, Joe, because we will need this space for Sunday. You're the pastor, what are you going to say? Joe said, that's okay, we won't have our service that day. You're not going to have your service. He said, the leaders of the arts community said, you have just changed our whole understanding of church and Christian faith. He felt, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. Like, wow, that's all I needed. My life has meaning and purpose. I got back to Joe when I heard this story and said, so what did you do that Sunday morning? Because I know people are going to ask, did you worship somewhere else? He said, actually, we didn't do a worship service. We just served instead of doing a service. So they served tea and coffee to the visitors. They gave out programs. They sold tickets. They served. Can you imagine how that enhances the name of this church and indeed of Christian faith in that community? So number 9, this is a challenge. Can we think about stopping doing things that don't serve the gospel? Things that maybe were useful 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and why are we doing them now? Because we've always done them. We say of the Anglican Church, our 7 last words are, we've always done it that way, but my hunch is it's true of other denominations as well. But one of the reasons people don't get involved with things outside the walls of the church is they don't have time. Well, is everything that we're involved in really that important? And number 10, free up leaders for ministry with non-church folk. This is a tough one. There may be people who are on 5 of your church committees who should be on 4 or 3 or 2 or maybe none at all. And they're there because they are good organizers, or everybody knows them, or they've been around a long time, or they're major donors to the church. But actually their ministry would be better used outside the 4 walls. Just free them up. There was a Baptist church in Ottawa that had a very senior civil servant as one of their congregation. A perfect guy to be an elder. But he was also involved in setting up evangelistic Bible studies around Parliament Hill. Over the years, 100 of those groups came into being. And they knew over the years of about 100 people who had come to Christian faith through those groups. And his church very insistently said, Don, we're not going to ask you to be an elder. You're very gifted to do that, but it'd be a waste of your gifts. You've got to go do this. We'll support you, pray for you, help you any way you need. But we're not going to suck up your time. I came across the phrase recently, vacuum cleaner church. You don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you do know what I'm talking about. Now, when Don left, he asked the person who'd been vice president of the association to take over. And the guy said, terribly sorry, I'm too involved in my church. I can't do it. His church was not willing to release him. And here's the last thing. We could spend an hour on each of these. But I think if we want to be missional, often there will be opposition. We need to find people who think as we do, who will support us, let us cry on their shoulder, who will pray for us, and just be there for us. And sometimes these things have to cross denominational lines. I think of an Anglican priest in my own area who has a mentor who is a Mennonite, and her church is just coming alive. Well, it's difficult to do these things by ourselves. We need others. And my experience is often that people across denominations, when they realize the way we're thinking, will actually be very supportive and very helpful. I want to spend the rest of our time on the other dimension, not so much making it easier for people to come to us, where they can explore their spirituality, learn about Christian faith, and hopefully move towards baptism and incorporation in the community. But this other model, which I'm calling the Go model. How do you do that? Well, a lot of our help in this respect has come from the Church of England, which I think it is fair to say is experiencing a renewal. At the last count, they discovered there are about 60,000 people in different denominations across the country who were involved in fresh expressions of church who were not involved in a church a few years ago. 60,000. If I heard of 100, I'd be excited. If I heard of 500, I'd be ecstatic. 60,000. But it's not easy. It has been very hard work. It's been worked on for many years. But they now say, as they look at how these new things have come into being, there is definitely a sequence of events that takes place. And again, as I was listening to Ted this morning, I thought some of those were true in his experience as well. Number one, listening and following God's call. Where is God at work? What is God asking us to do? That's why I wanted to call him when he said we didn't do research. But he was noticing, here are some people we haven't seen before. They look a little different from us, so who are they? And that was the first step towards that church getting involved in this whole amazing ministry. So listening and following God's call. Often that is followed not by starting a worship service for those people. That can be premature. Simply serving needs. And again, that's what the church that Ted leads was involved in. Here are some people who need a place to be. Let's show them a TV game or whatever it may be. Out of that comes a community. And again, you heard the story of how that happened. And then again, out of that community, as you grow in community, you grow closer to one another, it's easier to share your stories, whether they're stories of faith or stories of loss of faith or stories of never had faith. So often what comes about then is evangelism and disciple making. Now again, the people that Ted was working with were by and large already Christians, but we trust that they continued to grow in their following of Jesus through the ministry that was provided there. But if you're working with unchurched people, people with no church connection, often evangelism will be part of that. Them inquiring about Christian faith, maybe for the first time. And then at the end of that process comes worship, not earlier than that. One of the clearest examples that I've ever seen of this is a church in England. Now, this is in the city of Liverpool, so if you want to tell me this has nothing to do with rural ministry, I would understand that. Nevertheless, you listen for how this pastor works out those 5 principles that I've been outlining: listening, serving, building community, evangelizing, and finally, worship. I show you that not because anybody here should go and make bread. I think you understand that. It's the principle that she spent a year listening for God. Then moved on to the second stage, which was meeting people's needs, the bread, community forms. Didn't you love that line? This isn't a church, this is a house of God. How could you think otherwise? Out of that, then people have, as they share their stories, people have the opportunity, if they wish, to start attending the Bible study. And out of that, over time, comes a place of worship. I love the fact that she says this is true to the Methodist tradition, to get out from the four walls of the building. My guess is that several of you have congregations that are involved in fall fairs, that kind of thing. We have a similar thing in Hamilton on the street where our church is. It's called Lock Street. And one year I suggested that maybe as well as selling jams and jellies, although they're very good jams and jellies, maybe we should do something spiritual. So we put up a flip chart and invited people as they walked up and down Lock Street to write their frequently asked questions for God. And what we promised was that we would then do a sermon series in the fall based on people's actual questions. You could easily do that. And there's then this intrigue about, wow, are they going to preach about my question? Well, I should confess this wasn't terribly successful because we neglected the small detail of actually advertising the sermon series, but we won't talk about that. These things don't always work out. But the following May, I started a discussion group in our local coffee shop called The Bad Dog. And we advertised it this way. It was called The God Questions. At a recent Lock Street festival, passers-by were invited to write on a flip chart their questions to God. Some of those questions were, why are you such a jerk? Have you ever preached on that subject? There are people outside the church, that's their view of God. We don't like to think that way. God doesn't seem to have struck them dead, so God seems to be able to tolerate the question. I saw that as a way into talking about the problem of suffering. Second question, do you ever get mad? Do you ever cry? Is that a nice question? Who knew that people outside the church want to know that? I took that as a way into talking about incarnation. What is the point of life? Really? Like, I do want to know. It's a good way to talk about the gospel and being an apprentice of Jesus. Where do we go when we die? Well, that's an obvious one, isn't it? How many fingers am I holding up? That was a tougher one. So we said, if you have ever asked that kind of question, well, okay, maybe not that last one, you will be interested in Good God at the Bad Dog, a series of free-flowing discussions about the God questions over coffee and snacks at your favorite coffee shop, The Bad Dog at 229 Lock Street. And in fact, the snacks were provided free of charge by the owner, who was so delighted that we wanted to do this that she just wouldn't let us pay for them. Over the 4 weeks, we had about 12 people come. 6 were church members, 6 were not. I tried to start it again that fall. First one was May, second series was going to be November. In November, nobody came. So that was a total failure. I really shouldn't have wasted my time on that writing. No, it was a good thing to do. I said to my pastor, I don't think it's going to grow into a fresh expression of church. He said, you don't know that. Maybe a couple of years down the road we'll have church at the Bad Dog. Oh, yes, you're right. Or it might have been something that fed people back into the existing church. But even as a thing by itself that lasted 4 weeks and then it was gone, I think it was still a worthwhile thing to do. A young priest in Port Colborne who once a month does church on tap in his local pub. And a community has gathered around him who are asking spiritual questions, but wouldn't necessarily darken the doors of a regular church or a regular church service. Here is a program offered by a local Baptist church doing Alpha in a pub. Now, I don't know what your experience is, but in my world, Alpha and Baptists and pubs are not 3 things that you generally find in the same sentence. Even more outrageous, he charged them $100 to take the course. People paid good money to be evangelized. What is wrong with these people? For the $100, they got a beer and a burger every week. And they met appropriately enough in the upper room of this pub called the Yellow Griffin. Is that nice? Now, again, that might have turned into a self-supporting church. As it happens, a number of people became Christians, and their preference was to go back to the church that my friend was already pastoring. That's fine. But it was trying to reach people who are not reached any other way, not saying, come and do Alpha in the church basement. Who wants to go to a church basement? Certainly not me. I've spent far too much of my life in gloomy church basements already. Why not go to a place where people are comfortable and at home and do it there, and they might even pay you. Messy Church, you have heard about. Sue, who's at the back, is a national trainer for Messy Church and is finally actually leading a Messy Church herself in our congregation in Hamilton. And again, it's called Messy Church not because it's a way of getting people interested in Jesus and then getting them back into real church. It's called Messy Church because the hope is that some of these will actually turn into church in their own right. It's once a month. It's generally midweek. We do ours on a Thursday night, which is not uncommon. There's almost an hour of crafts as people arrive on a theme for the evening. Then there is a short 15 or 20 minute worship segment, again on the theme, with a Bible story and songs and a prayer, and then people have a meal. So you're done by 7 o'clock. It's 2 hours. It's for families. It is messy. My 5-year-old granddaughter said before the first one, "Is it really going to be messy?" Yes, dear, it is. It's not her experience of church. But even the name makes people smile and think, oh, maybe it will be okay. But some people hearing this or experiencing this think, well, does this actually make disciples? Does it make apprentices of Jesus Christ? Surely it's just a little light fun and giving kids a Bible story. So Judy Paulson, Anglican priest in Oshawa, did her Doctor of Ministry research on how does messy church affect people. And she discovered things like, when people get home from messy church, they discuss the Bible story they have heard. Families who have never prayed together are beginning to pray because of what they have learned at messy church. They're beginning to say grace. They're beginning to discuss, what does this stuff that we're learning mean in our daily lives? That sounds pretty good to me. I suspect there are people who've been in church all of their lives for whom those would be alien concepts. So it does actually work. Before we're done, I want to show you one more video, and I chose this one particularly because it is, again, it's from England. It's in a rural setting, so we can probably relate to it more easily than to this huge city of Liverpool. It's called Sunday 4-6. Again, these weird names. Why don't they just call it, St. Athanasius and get on with it? Anyway, you'll notice in this, the lady who tells the story is the deanery evangelist. Now, there's a concept unknown in England, in Canada, the deanery evangelist. But listen as she describes it, because she says, if I was starting again, I would do it a little differently. Doing this kind of thing doesn't always work. My good God at the bad dog didn't go where I hoped it would go. But we need permission to try these new things, even if they don't work out as we intend. So here's another story of someone saying, well, I tried it and it's going okay, but if I was doing it again, I would do it differently. And over time, we learn and things improve. So here is the story of Sunday 4-6 at the little village of Clawton.